In this video, we will be discussing some of the aspects anatomically of the thorax. Remember that we have pleura that will be located on the aspects of the ribs, and that's called costal parietal pleura, this shiny area. And that costal parietal pleura will turn to become diaphragmatic parietal pleura, and that line where it turns is called the line of pleural reflection. As that diaphragmatic pleura comes cranially, it will form part of the mediastinum or mediastinal parietal pleura on each side of the heart. Therefore, you'll have a complete structure called the mediastinum that runs down the middle, and the pleural cavities will be right and left on either side. What is missing in this cadaver, obviously, are the lungs, and they would have visceral or pulmonary pleura on their surface. Let's talk a little bit about the vessels that we can see, or the great vessels from the heart as it's sitting in the cavity. We're looking at the left side of the cadaver. I can nicely see the silhouette of the heart covered by pericardium, which we will talk about in a few more minutes. The vessels coming off of the aortic arch will be the brachiocephalic trunk and the left subclavian. From the brachiocephalic trunk will arise both our right and left, common carotid arteries before then turning into the right subclavian. That right subclavian artery is very difficult to see because of this large cranial vena cava coming into the cranial aspect of the heart. From our left subclavian, there are several branches that arise. One of these branches is called the costocervical trunk, and it's responsible for supplying the first few intercostal spaces of the ribs. Deep to that, sort of underneath it, is this artery, the vertebral artery, which will be going with the vertebral nerve through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra. As the subclavian continues, it will give rise to a superficial cervical coming up here to the shoulder and neck, which we briefly discussed in the thoracic limb, an internal thoracic, which will turn around the ventral aspect of the chest, and then that left subclavian would continue as the axillary artery. This is a good example of that internal thoracic coming around the ventral aspect of the rib cage. So if I closed this, you can see that that internal thoracic would run caudally. It will end or terminate as a superficial circumflex or superficial gastric and a superficial cranial epigastric and a musculophrenic, which comes around the diaphragm. And we'll investigate those vessels later. As we follow the aorta through that arch, and now it becomes our thoracic aorta, we can pick up now these dorsal intercostal arteries, many of them along the way, that will divide then into a dorsal branch which will supply the epaxial muscles, which we cannot observe here, and then the ventral branch that will course along the ventral aspect of the rib with the artery, vein, and nerve. So this would be your intercostal artery, vein, and nerve. Our costal parietal pleura here, and then that dense, fibrous white tissue is our transversalis fascia. One of the other vessels that arises is called the bronchoesophageal artery, and it typically will arise from the fifth intercostal artery and come ventrally to supply the bronchi as well as the esophagus, and therefore it's named the bronchoesophageal artery. Let's talk now a little bit about nerves that we see in the thoracic cavity, or the pleural cavity. First off, we notice that we have dorsally this sympathetic trunk, and every time I pull on that, it doesn't move, because at each different intercostal space there is a little ganglion and a ramus communicans coming from the spinal cord that connects to that ganglion and sympathetic trunk. So all along the sympathetic trunk, we'll have these little ganglion. As we course cranially, we see this large ganglion located approximately around the first rib, and that is the cervicothoracic ganglion. That cervicothoracic ganglion will give off a nerve, the vertebral nerve, which runs with the vertebral artery, again, up through the cervical vertebra, through the transverse foramen. If we follow that cervicothoracic ganglion around the left subclavian, it forms a circle, and we call that circle the ansa subclavia. Ansa being around subclavia, the subclavian artery. And at that junction where the ansa meets what we will be calling our vagosympathetic trunk is located the middle cervical ganglion here. If I course cranially, I can't get the thing away, from the middle cervical ganglion up the neck, I can see a vagosympathetic trunk located very close to our common carotid artery. You're going to have both a left and a right common carotid, as well as a left and right vagosympathetic trunk, and they always run together. That vagosympathetic trunk will continue up to the head, and when we get to the head region, we'll begin to see some of the other ganglion associated with the sympathetic nervous system. The key point about the vagosympathetic trunk is that the sympathetic fibers are going up to the head, while the vagus, or cranial nerve 10, fibers are running down to enter the thorax and abdomen. So let's focus now on that vagus part, or the parasympathetic part. So the vagus comes down with the sympathetic fibers, and when it reaches the middle cervical ganglion, which it does not synapse at, it continues past that and forms the vagus nerve, right or left. That vagus nerve will then give rise, hold on a second. That vagus nerve will then give rise to a dorsal and a ventral vagal branch. And the dorsal and ventral vagal branch will meet its partner on the other side to form a ventral vagal trunk or a dorsal vagal trunk. And those are named according to their position with respect to the esophagus, which is here. The vagus nerve also decided to do something a little odd, and that was give off a recurrent, what we call recurrent laryngeal. So on the left side, as the vagus came around the aortic arch, it gives off a small nerve, this nerve here, the recurrent laryngeal, which travels up the neck, closely associated with the trachea. And again, this is a paired structure. We will have a similar situation on the right side as well, so that this would be our right recurrent laryngeal nerve. Do not confuse your vagosympathetic trunk with your recurrent laryngeal. Recurrent laryngeal will always sit directly on the trachea. The other nerve that I do not want you to confuse is this nerve, and this is the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is going to course through the mediastinum and attach to the diaphragm, which it innervates. It can oftentimes be confused for the vagus nerve, but the vagus nerve is going to be associated with the esophagus, closer to the midline, and does not go right into the diaphragm. Oh. In terms of lymph nodes in the thorax, there's one. If you find a lymph node right here between where the bronchi divide, that is called the tracheobronchial lymph node. Some of the other lymph nodes, I can't find any really good ones, but there oftentimes are these little ones that lie dorsal to the dorsal aorta that can be found. This would be the thymus in a young animal located in the cranial mediastinum. And oftentimes in this area of fascia and
ours got torn out.
Goop, you might find some cranial mediastinal lymph nodes. Once again, notice how much fat is surrounding in the mediastinum, which is on the surface of our pericardium. So let's talk briefly about that fibrous pericardium. That first, again, the first layer on the outside would be mediastinal pleura. Then we have fibrous pericardium here. And if I looked on the inside of that fibrous pericardium, where my probe is running right now, that would be parietal serous pericardium. The space that my probe is in is the pericardial cavity. That's where we can get fluid built up. And then on the surface of the heart itself would be visceral serous pericardium, or epicardium. As the heart lays here in the chest, on this left side, we can see a fairly nice periconal interventricular groove, which then tells us this is the right ventricle and this is the left ventricle. We will do more discussion about the heart after a short break.